Hello, everyone. GM. Welcome to another episode of the Solfate Podcast, where we have conversations with blockchain founders and builders in the Solana ecosystem. Welcome to the episode. This one was super great. We had Stepan, co-founder of Squads, the very, very well-known multi-sig product protocol, whatever you want to call them. It was a great conversation.
It really was. I mean, not only is Squads a huge deal, but like Stepan himself was awesome. Just like super fun to chat with.
He was super fun to chat with. I was very surprised to learn his personal background. He actually comes from the M&A world. For those of you who don't know, that's mergers and acquisitions. So in the non-blockchain world, he was helping with like merging large companies and the governance structures of large companies. And I think that's very, very interesting to compare and contrast, and which we did in the episode, of how these like governance structures of traditional, regular, non-blockchain industries and companies go to how that governance translates to blockchain. Thought that was super interesting to talk about.
Yeah, we called it out in the conversation that like a lot of people in the crypto space are introduced to the idea of governance through crypto, and maybe don't realize that governance,
it's all around us.
Governance is not a new thing, right? The idea of like how you govern business entities or trusts or other types of structures has been around for a very, very long time. Arguably that's what government is, right? Is an entity with some kind of governance structure behind it. So has existed for a very long time. But super cool. Loved hearing sort of how Squads ended up in the multi-sig space, how they think about multi-sig as a necessary primitive for a bunch of things in crypto and how they're solving that problem. Definitely like they have an awesome product, awesome protocol, awesome people. The chat with Stepan was just awesome. You definitely jump in and listen.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing is that it was just, for a non-developer founder, like you don't have to be a developer to be in the blockchain space or in the Solana ecosystem. Like he's a non-developer founder. Doesn't mean he's not technical, because like he's still very technical.
For sure. I think in the show I say non-technical, which is probably not true. Like he is very technical, and lots of people are very technical that are not software engineers. But that part of the conversation I actually am really happy about and would love for everyone to listen to, because I think we need more non-developers participating in creating the software that crypto powers in order to make it better for everyone, right? It's like we need a lot more profiles, if you will, in order to make the right products and right stuff. So, cool stuff.
All right, let's just go ahead and dive right in. Let's do it.
You're most known for in the ecosystem. I'll backtrack with that and say, like, at least what I know you from is as sort of the co-founder of Squads Protocol. I would love to hear sort of your personal story of getting into crypto, getting into Solana, and sort of starting Squads. So if you can be as brief or as long-winded with that as you want. I think we love whatever you have to say about it.
Sure. I did corporate M&A before I got into crypto full time. So it's not a traditional, I guess, crypto story. I did mostly sort of restructurings and corporations kind of, and just structuring complex M&A transactions, mostly English law. I lived in London for about 7 years. And during the, I think 2017 boom, it was still very new, but people in the sort of law firm I was at the time, some of the clients were asking, what's Bitcoin? Like, how do we invest? What's potential like legal repercussions of us doing that? And like, how does it all work? Like, what's a blockchain even? And so that was like my first major exposure. I had to write some memos and kind of figure it out, like to basically distill it into simple wording for like very non-technical people, and me myself being non-technical. So that's kind of how it started for me. And then it kind of died down after, the cycle has ended at the time. I was curious about crypto, but didn't really get back into it until I think 2020, when I was curious specifically around like the governance space on ETH, because it was kind of clear like what crypto can do for finance and how that could be disrupted. I think for what I was interested in was like governance, how it could disrupt what I was doing, right? In terms of formation of legal entities and potential like ownership on the internet, like all of that seemed really interesting to me. And so I was kind of researching DAO tooling on ETH and like how it was all kind of shaping up. Early 2021, I learned about Solana. Yeah, it just seemed really cool. And then the hackathon rolled around, like Solana season hackathon. We just, joined the Discord together with Danny, my co-founder now, and, my friend for about 10 years. He comes from like finance background. And we just started talking to people saying, we're thinking about building something governance related. We don't really know what it is. If you're also interested to form a team, come and talk to us. And about 30 people responded. There was like some selection that happened during a couple calls, but we ended up forming a sort of team of 6, I think it was at the time, just to figure out a very simple all-in-one mobile-first governance platform MVP. We thought that would be like the super easy thing we could build in a hackathon. Yeah, I mean, obviously we
casually
didn't really
trying to build an all-in-one tool for a hackathon. Yeah, I'm sure that's pretty easy to do, right?
Exactly. And like it was very like also very consumer facing in many ways, and also mobile first in an ecosystem which didn't have that many primitives at all to build on top of. So that was ambitious. But we didn't really build much for the sort of end date of the hackathon. But the team mostly, like not all 6 people ended up kind of joining the team when we jumped into it full time, but a lot of them. And so during the summer, it was kind of nights and weekends. We, were iterating on the idea. And then the first thing we kind of figured out was that, well, before we actually get to building what we want, we need to, what are the core primitives that need to exist in the ecosystem for that to be a possibility? And so that's kind of how we first got to like a governance framework or a governance platform. And then we even, sort of stripped it down further to a multi-sig primitive that also was non-existent on Solana. And so it was a pivot still, like from governance to multi-sig, and we still feel like it's been like a major turning point for us. But basically, yeah, that's the story how we got to Solana. And like from September 2021, we went at it full time and raised the sort of the first pre-seed round we did. And then just dropped what we were doing and went to Solana.
That's awesome. I want to pick at one thing you said, which is that like the thing that interested you was how crypto could disrupt what you were already doing with sort of structuring business entities and that sort of thing. I think for a lot of people, maybe this is a misread of the environment, but I think a lot of people, the first time they've ever even heard the word governance, at least used in that sense, is with DAOs, right? The first time they've ever really thought about like entities and how those entities are managed and how you create groups that sort of decide the direction of that entity. But that's obviously, it's not exclusive to crypto. It's a thing that exists out, in sort of traditional business management, where you've got these companies that have sort of governance entities, whether that's a board or something, right? I'm curious to sort of hear you do a little bit of compare and contrast between a little primer of like what is non-crypto governance, right? And what do we still have to do in crypto to get feature parity, if you will?
Well, I think outside of crypto, governance is really about, I think the closest concept would be corporate governance, right? Which is a very broad term that can mean sort of a lot of things. It can mean sort of interactions between the shareholders and the board. And, potentially if it's like a public company, it gets kind of closer to the world of, what we see with, potentially analogy to token holders, right? I also feel like today there's a kind of a requirement to pretend that they're very different things that have nothing to do with one another. And that, we shouldn't conflate shareholders and token holders and like, because it's all, because tokens are not securities and all that, right? I think the way I kind of see it is that maybe there is a world where in the future we wouldn't have to pretend, and actually tokens are just a much better technical implementation of equity and shares. And some of them should be securities, but they're just securities on much better technical rails, which are not sort of encumbered by, old infrastructure. In my opinion, similarities between corporate governance or like, non-crypto governance and governance we see in crypto in many ways is very similar, right? You have stakeholders, be it, shareholders or token holders that to a different extent participate in, life of a protocol, life of a company. They're entitled to getting certain distributions of value that is accrued towards the protocol. Similar to what you see, with dividend distribution for shareholders. So I think there are a lot of similarities. I think the governance that actually, but that's if we compare, the governance we potentially want to see in crypto to the governance outside of it. I think the governance we actually have right now that works is very much limited to, these very core functions of the protocol And even like the proof of stake systems, and like that's probably the cleanest form of governance in crypto that we've seen to date. When you're thinking about protocol governance, I think there's a lot of decentralization theater. Like protocols are still very much controlled by a bunch of entities, but there are examples where they're more decentralized. But I think as time goes by, we will see potentially innovation and kind of a very different way to govern a business or a protocol, which will be actually much less similar to what we see outside of crypto. But right now, I think the similarities are pretty apparent. And that's why I think also many people are frustrated with governance. And it also has its cycles, right? Like we see people get excited about DAOs in certain periods of time. And then, the hype kind of dies down and then it goes back. I think last time we've seen that with, Constitution DAO. But I think the excitement around DAOs and governance during that period was less around governance itself. It was more about, wait, we can actually form a DAO and raise a bunch of money for something. So again, it was more financial in nature than it was around like figuring out a new form to organize a bunch of humans. Yeah, but to get back to the point, I think like the purest form of governance right now is probably the like you have on Solana, a bunch of validators around the world that actually don't know each other, but they come together to make sure that the system works. There's like economic incentives, there's other incentives. And you see that with like Solana upgrades, right? Like when the network needs to upgrade or like something needs to happen, you need these validators to come to consensus. And this is, I think, the purest form of governance we see today, which is quite unique because they're actually directly responsible for the network running, right, and being operational.
On the note of protocol governance, especially with like we were just talking about your background in like dealing with traditional corporate entities and their governance, do you think that protocol governance does need to be truly decentralized? Because like if you think about any Fortune 500 company around the world, there's some amount of decentralization within this corporate entity. They're possibly a global company. They have locations all around the world. They're servicing customers all around the world. But when it comes down to it, there's still generally a centralized entity of individuals. The board of directors, you have maybe your C-suite executives that are the primary driving function of that protocol, business, company, whatever you want to call it. Do you think that in the blockchain space that it needs to be decentralized to the point where it's anonymous people around the world contributing and pushing things forward? Or do you think that it kind of will more than likely like hinder because of this decentralization, social decentralization, if you will?
Right. I think like it really depends on the protocol, right? For some protocols, decentralization is a great feature and it should be there. For some, it's a bug and it just doesn't need to exist. I think we're sort of right now think that there has been at least kind of movement towards that, like everything needs to decentralize, maybe because majority of people that get involved in crypto want to eventually launch a token. Those two interests kind of align that like, well, it's a good narrative that we want to decentralize the protocol, but also in the process of doing that, there's like economic upside for us potentially because we can, launch the token. I think for some, protocols in crypto, decentralization is really helpful, particularly if it's, a core primitive in the ecosystem. But also like bear in mind, there needs to be something that should be governed, right? For instance, for something like squads, at least at this point, like it's immutable. There's nothing really to govern on the protocol layer. We're building the next iteration of it, and that's not immutable yet. But the very core piece of squads even, right? Like there's really nothing to govern, right? It's just there, it works, and you can go and interact with it, right? But then for I think like a lot of the DeFi protocols that need to constantly be updated, need to evolve. I think there is a moment where they kind of find their, clearest product market fit. They are, core primitive in the ecosystem. There is a world where it would be healthy for them to be decentralized. And I think it really is it should be judged just on a sort of per protocol basis. I think that makes sense. And then there are certain, I guess, like proof of stake networks where decentralization is like a core factor, right? It's a determining factor whether I will build on a chain or I will use a chain. So I think in that case, it's absolutely paramount. I think when it comes to protocols, I also would probably like to say that, it's still a divisive topic, but like immutability is important for a lot of this stuff. So I'd rather see more protocols immutable than decentralized, just because I'm skeptical of, the level they can get decentralized. So that's just another point that we've been thinking about. But also, I really don't want to, sort of paint here with like a really broad brush. Like it's really case specific, right? And so it really depends.
There's so many. It depends in Decentralization is absolutely a spectrum, in my opinion. Like, depending on what it is at the base layer, base blockchain, no matter what blockchain it is, like being incredibly decentralized is very, very important. But once you get to the application layer and maybe even slightly below that, the protocol layer, it's like strongly, and it depends on what's going on, how much traction they have, kind of conversation. So yeah,
we've sort of touched on something that I think is important, which is sort of removing dogma. And it's not, does everything need to be decentralized? It's, well, what is the purpose? What are we using this for? Or you mentioned when you were talking about tokens, about how right now there's sort of the ecosystem generally, it pushes back really hard on tokens being similar to equity, when in reality, it's like, well, it depends. There are some tokens that are a lot like equity, and there are some tokens that aren't. They're more like a currency, and there are other tokens that it's neither. There's no sort of legal counterpart for it, and we need to create something new, right? That sort of thing. I think ultimately what interests me the most about blockchain technology is the new primitives it provides and the optionality that those primitives give people. And that optionality, I think, is what people forget every once in a while, right? Is like, in their little corner of the world, they might be really focused on decentralization. And so to them, it's like everything should be about decentralization, when in fact, you could even have like a very application specific layer one chain is centralized. And that's okay, because it's meant to be this niche thing that not everybody is using for like these arbitrary trustless transactions. But then you might have something like Solana or ETH that you do want very decentralized, because it's meant to be this super broad, layer that any application can fit into. So I find that really interesting. And I feel like especially the sorts of things that you're working on need to facilitate all kinds of different use cases. Right? Like you went sort of deep down enough. Like you said, you sort of kept stripping away until you got to sort of multi-sig. And it's like, oh yeah, you're fairly application agnostic, where it's like, we want to support all the things that you're working on,
I think that's a very interesting framing, because like we're thinking constantly in terms of even, the stack that we use, for the app. Like there's the on-chain layer, there's the UI layer, and like you can keep drilling down and think, which parts of that should be as decentralized as possible, which parts of that should be immutable, which parts of that, like it really is a constant question you ask yourself. Is there like more value in something because it's decentralized, as well as, providing the features you want? And I think we've been thinking a lot about different ways to self-custody your assets, right? Like you can do it with a multi-sig, you can do it with a, traditional wallet like, Phantom or Backpack. There's MPC providers, there's, full custodial services. You can use Coinbase, right? And so there's so many ways to do it. And I think in the self-custody context, I think decentralization and immutability, when we started this, I didn't care that much for any of it. Like, if it works, I'm happy for it. And then 2 years later, and like after so many things happened, and like a bunch of things collapsed, a bunch of things survived and became Lindy, potentially, and more resilient, I am actually now valuing decentralization a lot more. And the idea that like, if there is a very, when I'm thinking about, even squads on Solana, like, okay, there's this, Solana, this very performant and decentralized blockchain, and, Squads v3, which is the current version, is, immutable, formally verified, audited about 6 times total, contract that can hold assets, right? And I'm thinking, well, like those are the two parts of the stack I probably want as decentralized and immutable as possible. And I think one of the cool things that, even building on Solana allows us for, like building on a decentralized blockchain, is that all we need to do at this point is we just need to build a program that, that works, and build a UI on top. Like we don't actually need to think about decentralization or bootstrapping our own validators. Compare that to, like even, MPC providers that provide, custodial, semi-custodial services, or even just non-custodial tooling. There's like Fireblocks, Copper, and then there's tons of more MPC wallets. The core logic of basically the multi-party computation is actually, completely off-chain, right? So in many ways, you are the behest of that, specific private company being around to provide you that infra, right? As opposed to something that you see, with Safe on EVM, where, it's an open source immutable contract that just lives on the blockchain. The blockchain is decentralized, the blockchain is running, And so even if the company that's providing you the interface goes away, the assets are there, the program's there, and there's absolutely nothing that can compromise the security of it. So I think, as you kind of get deeper into things, and I guess as you spend more time in crypto, you are valuing decentralization in some places a lot more. In some places you think, well, I don't care for it, and it's fine for it to be completely centralized. So again, it kind of comes down to that case by case.
I want to dig into multi-sig a little bit, right? Because that's obviously like the core offering behind Squads. And I guarantee there are still listeners who have never used a multi-sig, and probably some listeners who don't even know what it is, at least not beyond just sort of an abstract general idea. So would you mind describing what a multi-sig is, and then also maybe describing the various use cases for it, why you find it important as a primitive in the ecosystem?
Right. So I think multi-sigs are usually called wallets. That's something we call them as well. But I think in reality, they're just a consensus mechanism, right? And it's a consensus mechanism for a bunch of keys on the blockchain to agree whether a transaction should, go through or not, right? I think that's probably the simplest explanation we figured out internally. But from a sort of product perspective, it really is a wallet. It can be used as a wallet that is managed by a group of people. It can be 2 or 3 people. It can be, up to, I think it's kind of unlimited, but for ideal user experience, you probably want to cap it at 20, because after that point, it gets pretty chaotic. But it really is in the simplest form, it's a shared wallet that you have basic rules for, like threshold, which allows the transaction to go through. But the reason I like the consensus mechanism definition more is because when you think about wallets, you're thinking about treasury assets, right? You're thinking about your SOL, your USDC that you can manage together. What you can really manage with a multi-sig is anything that exists on chain, right? So today we've expanded that definition to program management, right? So if you're launching a program on mainnet, it's upgradable on Solana, right? So it has an upgrade authority which needs to be held somewhere. And potentially if that's, a protocol that holds a lot of TVL or has a lot of users, it's really valuable. And you don't really want that to be held in a single wallet. And so decentralizing control amongst your team or amongst a group of people, over that very core asset that you have is very important. And then we expanded that to validators. So there's, withdrawal authority that validators have, right? So you can expand the multi-sig to token authorities, right? Because you're launching a token on Solana and you want to make sure that, the mint authority is actually with your team and not with a single developer. Because if I have the mint authority, I can mint more tokens, I can burn tokens and change its, metadata and properties. And so I think this is where we started discovering that multi-sig is actually a very, broad mechanism that you can apply to any asset that exists on chain and any authority that you can manage jointly. Definitely killer features today on Solana is treasury and programs. Those are the 2 main assets that every team on Solana has. And the product that we have today, at least the main one, is really positioned towards teams and organizations and sort of mostly teams building things on Solana, but also there's venture funds that use Squads, and then there's kind of high to mid net worth, I guess, individuals that want a more secure experience for their individual assets, so that they use a multi-sig as well. That can also, the multi-sig is a very agnostic concept, right? So it can be used by individuals, but the product offering that we have is positioned towards organizations, and really is about managing tokens, programs, treasuries, validators, and then there's also the very sort of agnostic part of the app, which is a transaction builder. So you can really craft any transaction to interact with any program with your multi-sig, and that will still require the multi-sig approval to go through.
I didn't realize you guys had a just generic transaction builder. That's pretty sweet. It's like Solana Pay. It's like Solana Pay is not just for payments. You can do any transaction you want, and the possibilities are endless. I guess to kind of dig down that rabbit hole there is, so you've listed multiple, we'll call them features, multiple use cases that various ecosystem teams and individuals are using Squads multi-sigs for, or the various components within the Squads platform. I'm curious from I guess a technical architecture kind of perspective of when Squads as a organization and as a team is going to more or less I guess for lack of better phrasing, add support for an additional feature, whether it's like you said, like validator authorities, you need to be able to properly handle those specific instructions in order to facilitate validators to actually withdraw their stake tokens and those sorts of things. When you're adding these types of features within the Squads protocol, is it a very one-off a la carte interaction where it's here's a specific other portion of the blockchain that we want to integrate within Squads natively. You want to support validators. You want to support SPL tokens. Do you guys have to kind of like write a bunch of custom logic for that, or is it a pretty straightforward and seamless, I guess, integration process in order to actually add these more specific use cases?
Yeah, so it's I guess the beauty of the way the Squads works today, at least, is that it's very agnostic, right? So everything is just an arbitrary instruction from a on-chain perspective, right? So the program actually doesn't care what you're doing from what features we're offering. The program doesn't actually care if at least we're talking about expanding, as we kind of started building towards this whole suite of features with, validator management, program management, token management. So those features are just, we just need to accommodate them in the interface, right? We need to provide a nice user experience and like a user flow for teams to be able to interact with. But from an on-chain perspective, the program's been immutable for, I think, about 7 months now. And
this is the V3 program, right?
Yeah, exactly. We haven't touched the on-chain code since, because we can't really do anything with it anymore. So the program's immutable, right? But I think we're now working on the next iteration of the protocol, V4, which we're going to launch sometime next month. And so that like kind of accommodates for a bunch of features that we wanted to have on chain, right? So that includes roles. So when you add a key to the multi-sig, you can now specify whether they can only be an executor, a voter, or an initiator of a transaction, or any one of those three, right? So basically, it gives you more granularity in terms of what a specific key can do within the multi-sig. We added spending limits, so you can say that that token from that vault, up to that amount within that time frame, you can withdraw or send to any address without passing the threshold, or you can whitelist a specific address where only there without the threshold you can actually send the asset, right? So for those things, that's why we're building the next program, right? Because there are features that either we figured out users will want and then validate it, or they communicated to us that we really want this. Like another one which is really big is time locks, right? Because as we're thinking about more protocols, coming live on Solana and thinking about decentralization, kind of intermediary step between you launching a token and giving up control to the token holders of the program upgrade authority or the treasury. The intermediate step is, you would say, we have a multi-sig that manages the program upgrade. Here it is. And then every time you upgrade the protocol, like the reason time lock is kind of an intermediate solution is because you can say, well, yes, we're still, the team still has control over the program, but there's a time lock of 24 hours. So whenever we ship an upgrade, you have 24 hours. Like if you think that there's something malicious in the upgrade, or we're doing something you disagree with as a user, you have 24 hours before we can actually execute on chain this upgrade to pull the funds, right? Or to do whatever with the protocol to sort of protect yourself. And so I think that's like another one that we have to accommodate on chain. So really it depends on the feature, right? If it's something that big and requires on chain changes, it needs to be, the next iteration of the program that accommodates for it. But majority of the things that we ship are very much in the UI. And so on an on-chain level, the program doesn't really care. It's all just arbitrary instructions.
When I'm curious, sort of given your background in M&A, you sound fairly technical, right? Like you've been deep in this for the last couple of years. Had you done any dev work before, jumping into Squads? Like, what was your sort of level of technical, and by technical I mean like in a programming sense, knowledge before Squads?
I've seen The Social Network. And a bunch of other movies. But
Perfect.
I do enjoy that movie. It's a pretty good movie.
It is pretty good, right? No, I have no experience, right? And it's purely just, Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just saying this is great because that's what I thought, and my follow up question to that was like, I'm sure there are people similar to you who have a ton of sort of business or marketing or operations background and are struggling to find their place in what is, at present at least, a very like technical founding environment. You've clearly done a phenomenal job at navigating that and saying like, hey, this is not all about programming. Like there's a bunch here, and I'm gonna like be a co-founder and build an awesome thing. What advice would you give someone in a similar position who maybe is like trying to figure out how to navigate this highly technical environment without previously having that kind of technical background?
That's a great question. I think before I answer it, I can give like a short opinion, I guess, which is kind of contrarian. Like I think there's an argument to be made that the fact that someone's not technical, doesn't have the background, can potentially be actually really helpful in navigating something like building these complex things on blockchains, just from a standpoint that I need to I worry a lot more. Like if you're a very experienced developer that has done a lot of things, has tons of experience, usually it's like, move fast, break things. And the approach is like very, let's just ship it, let's get it out. Like it's going to work, it's going to be fine. Like we'll audit it, at some point. And, this kind of mentality, I think like I never, because I'm non-technical and like I actually don't have that background, for me, it's like, wait, like let's get a second opinion on this. Like, let's see how that can work. And so there's like from, at least if you're like security first and like security oriented in development, that really helps. Just because like I need to stop, ask people to stop and explain things to me. And then, when we get auditors involved, like I also like to really understand like, what's the issue that's being highlighted and like how we're dealing with it. And so I think that's also the fact that I need to catch up helps other people to like on the team that are very smart and much smarter than me, to also rethink those things. And like there's an element that helps. I think in terms of advice, like it's still, you need to make sure that like you're surrounded by the right people, right? If it was just me, I probably wouldn't get too far ahead, right? So I was lucky to meet, I guess, tens now, or like, yeah, tons of people that were super helpful and smart, and that yeah, I mean, I think made me at least very focused on the mission and in terms of figuring out like what parts, even of the technical aspects I need to be aware of and where I can sort of trust them, right? And so I think that's probably the most important part, but you definitely shouldn't think that you can't get into crypto if you're non-technical, right? And I'm not even talking about like doing, BD or marketing, like obviously that part is available to you, but even if you're thinking about like becoming a co-founder, as long as you get the right, technical co-founder on board, it probably will be beneficial that you have, a very different background than your other co-founder. So I think that really helps. And yeah, I hope more people do it, but definitely audit your code, formally verify it if you can.
I love that answer. I
wholeheartedly agree with that. Across the board.
Yeah. Well, it's just I will say one thing that you alluded to, but I just want to make it explicit for those people is like you do have to want to understand things, right? Because it's like you said, it can be beneficial to be coming in with a non-technical background, and I wholeheartedly agree. But the things that you pointed to as positives came from you being non-technical and you asking people to stop and explain it to you, right? Like you're a forcing function only because you're willing to be a forcing function. If you just come in and let the devs do their thing, and say like, well, I don't know, so I'm just going to let them do it, then that benefit isn't there. But if you're willing to do what you just described, which is say, hey, I have something to add, both in terms of my understanding that like regular user UX and dev UX is not the same thing. In like
it's very much a struggle in the blockchain space.
Absolutely. Or like you said, in the questions that I ask, making you rethink your sort of traditional developer assumptions. Me saying like, hold on, you need to help me, a non-technical person, understand why I should be comfortable with releasing this, right? And by pushing back like that, you prompt a rethinking of the structure. Oh, maybe that isn't as secure as we thought. Hold on, let's get that second opinion, or that sort of thing. So like, yeah, totally agree. I would love for more non-developers to get involved with building things. And by the way, I think a lot of developers in the ecosystem also want that, because a lot of developers know that they're not the one that's going to come up with like a great product. They know that they can build it, but they don't know what to build. Right. So it's like they want non-technical folks who have great ideas and great leadership to come and lead them. Basically, I often feel that way, if I'm being honest, as an engineer. It's like, I often just tell me what to build, like,
Yeah, and I think like the hard part is that if you're surrounded by smart developers and like people that are actually curious, there's like so much new stuff that's always coming up, and like it's really a good developer always wants to dive into the new thing and figure out like how we can use it and go on a tangent. And I think a lot of my kind of job, at least early days, was like, definitely making sure that we do figure out whether that's something relevant to us, like this, new feature that, the new Solana upgrade allows for, or like this new protocol that we can potentially leverage for building a better product for our users. but then like figuring out, does it really fit into what we're trying to do? And it's a constant, kind of back and forth on that front. But I think it's like for us, because we have three co-founders. There's Sean, who's the technical lead and like the most technical person. I'm like completely on the opposite side of the spectrum. And then we have Danny, who's kind of in the middle, who's responsible for basically all the product work and the UX. But he also like understands the software development process by now really well. And so he's definitely way more technical than me. And so having those three people on the spectrum, like on different places there, really helps us to, I can come up with something very broad and like very just, completely product centric. Danny can then kind of bring it closer to reality in terms of what we can actually build. And then Sean actually needs to go there and build it. And then there's obviously, a dev team that supports him in every way. So I think like that worked well for us up to this point. That said, though, I think V3 and the UI that we have on top of V3 is still it's pretty basic and pretty minimal. And with V4 and the new UI that we're shipping on top, like we are trying to make it more, SaaS-like in some shapes or forms, because we kind of figured out that our core user, is a team building on Solana. They're using a bunch of SaaS tooling, in terms of traditional Web2 stuff. And so we are going to try and make that experience closer. Like with a new UI, the experience will try to get it closer to traditional SaaS in terms of some more kind of bells and whistles being off-chain, but providing you kind of a better experience. And so it's interesting to see like how you can, start with something very minimal, and pretty much everything, like our V2, the previous iteration of the protocol, like everything that could be on chain was on chain. And so that made like every Squads transaction like would be very expensive, because like I think descriptions to proposals would be also on chain, right? And so that also takes some size. And so I think as we're kind of discovering, like it's a constant balance of figuring out like what's on chain, what's off chain, and then as you're thinking, well, we want to provide a great experience to the user. It's getting very close to a more traditional software development process. So it's really it's been really interesting to see like how it's been developing. And I guess we're still pretty early from like the way we kind of think about the product and like where it can go. it feels like we're at least maybe 30% there max. So it's still a long way to go.
Is governance still like a long-term focus?
No. I mean, like,
or is
it's not, right? We've been thinking about this a lot, and we really like the distinction that as soon as you start decentralizing control over any of the assets that you can manage with Squads, if you want to decentralize it to the token holders, this is where our journey with you ends. So everything up until that moment, when it's about team level control, where you're controlling things as a company or as a fund or an institution or any kind of organization, this is what we're building for. And then, because just DAOs are very different customers and they're very different users, and they just want very different things. And so, at least at this point, we feel like we'd rather go in a different direction, where potentially would venture into kind of going after a user that's not even using blockchains at the moment, right? Like if you're a startup that is open to not having a bank account, right, and hold a bunch of USDC in a squad, and then just off ramp it when you pay your employees, because you don't want to be tied to a traditional financial system, that's a user that's more interesting to us today than DAOs, just because we feel like that kind of user is like a natural extension of what we've been kind of focusing on, as opposed to something that's kind of going in parallel. And, we just don't want to, I guess, spread ourselves too thin. I think that's
So in terms of like expansion of the product, you just mentioned sort of traditional companies keeping USDC in a Squads multi-sig and then off-ramping as needed. In terms of expansion of the product, would you consider expanding to having your own off-ramp for those sorts of things? Or like I guess I'm curious, because I imagine your company is full of ambitious people, and so as soon as things are locked down, right, you'll keep adding, which you're already doing. You're talking about V4 and what's on there. So I'm just curious, like where do you keep adding once you feel like you've exhausted the core of what a multi-sig is, or is that even possible? Will that never be exhausted, right?
No, I think that's a very good question. I think like the key focus for us in the coming months at least will be around just the product offering on Solana specifically, right? Like what you can actually, how can we enhance the experience for teams and their workflows when it comes to managing their treasury, their programs, and like a bunch of other developer assets. So that's going to be, the main focus for a while. And I think the potential next step would be, we also really like the idea that Solana is, it's really fast, it's scalable, it provides, for a great user experience that's similar to what you get with just, traditional Web2. But at the same time, users want exposure to, other assets, right? So they want potentially to hold some ETH or some Bitcoin. But my kind of vision that we've been discussing internally a lot is like, you can use Solana, and I guess you should use Solana as a, UX consensus layer. And this is where you set up your multi-sig, you add the keys, you set the core logic, but the assets that you manage with that layer should exist on any chain, right? And I think like you get right now with MPC, where there's like an off-chain infra stack that allows you to manage assets on Bitcoin, Solana, or Ethereum, would rather take that part that's being off-chain, that's being used off-chain right now, and put it on Solana and secure it with, smart wallet logic and smart wallet system. But then you can manage assets on any chain. I think like that would potentially be a more interesting expansion for us moving forward. And then, going after a type of user that, yes, already is exposed to crypto, but potentially is unaware that they can use Solana, to secure the core logic, but then actually manage assets on any chain. And I think as a potential next iteration of it, it would be what I mentioned before. Like, if you're a kind of a tech-oriented startup that is willing to not have a bank account, that probably would be the next step. But I think our own off-ramp or any of those things like that's, I think for now, at least not in our wheelhouse. And there's a bunch of cool providers that we work with, like CoinFlow I think there's Mezzo that's also going live on Solana pretty soon, that we like a lot more, as partners, as opposed to building that ourselves. But you never know, right? Like maybe in a couple of years, I'll have a different opinion on that.
That's cool. I like the idea of like use the chain to secure what you can, and then add bells and whistles that make the experience easier and more useful off chain. I in fact, there's a bunch of that I can imagine where it's like, yeah, I would give up a certain amount of staking yield or pay some kind of subscription if it meant that I could have more, you kind of mentioned itself, a more like traditional SaaS UI that gives me like email notifications for certain things that I want to know, right? Like that sort of stuff. So that's cool.
Yeah, and I guess like as we've been kind of developing the new UI, like that's been the main focus, like figuring out what is this experience, what is that SaaS like experience that we can bring to crypto offering, right? Like because right now again we're still servicing very much teams that are very crypto native, but yeah, I think like for the foreseeable future, that's the focus, and then we'll take it from there. But there's still so much to do, just purely on delivering the multi-sig experience that we feel like should be delivered, and so we have plenty of things to do.
There's always too many things to do and not enough time to do it. Story of life,
There was a minute there where I considered like storing all of my business assets on chain. And I still probably would I would consider it if there were like an easy way to make it happen. So maybe I'll be a future customer. That being said, Nick and I, for the show, we do have a Squads multi-sig set up for sort of managing our like show expenses and paying editors and that sort of thing.
No, that's great. And I think like it really depends where you're coming from, right? Because like we have a bunch of users that would very much rather use a squad than a bank, because like the places where they come from, banks are very unreliable, and a decentralized blockchain with a reliable infra is actually much better. And so really, I guess it also depends on sort of where you're coming from. But I think as we're kind of bridging the experience and, the blockchain itself is becoming more resilient, the protocol is becoming better. People from places where banks are still okay, figuring out, well, this is a more programmable bank account I can do a lot more things with. And, I can do it all myself permissionlessly. And that could potentially be a feature that draws more people in.
That's part of what makes me consider it in the first place is the ability to basically, have some automatic asset management where I can sort of pull funds on a schedule.
The ultimate banking API,
Yeah, but then it's like, okay, cool. I've got 6 months of runway that is just sitting here, not earning anything, not doing anything. There's I could at least stake USDC and get a few percent yield on that versus having it sit in a checking account, not making anything, right? So there's definitely like pros to having assets on chain, I think.
Yeah, I mean, DeFi cycle on Solana supposedly should bring you a bunch of opportunities and reliable primitives to put your.
I hear it's
USDC.
back. I hear it's back.
I'm already trying to take advantage of them with my personal portfolio, as small as it may be, but still hesitant with my business assets.
Yeah, I mean, you have to, again, as we the theme of this podcast is like, it's case by case, right? Some protocols are ready for you to ape in. Some probably you should wait a bit, but yeah.
Yep. Well, it is unfortunate, but that's the nature of building new things, right? Is like there's going to be some stumbles along the way, So that I definitely weigh smart contract exposure as like
it's a risk factor you need to take into account.
Even if it's a smart contract even if it's open source and I've looked through it myself, it's like there are far smarter developers than me who have had exploits or hacks on their smart contracts. So even just me reading through a smart contract doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe. I more judge based on kind of what you just said about like the V3 squads contract, right? Which is it's immutable and it's been running for X number of months. And so it's like every subsequent month we have higher and higher confidence in this is good. It's solid. We can't make changes. It seems like it's hack proof. Like, cool. We trust it, kind of thing. And every once in a while, it's like, whereas every once in a while, it's like I can get some really high yield by aping into this contract that launched yesterday, and I haven't seen anything about it. I don't know how it works, but I'll put a couple % of my portfolio in there and see what happens, and then, oops.
No, that totally makes sense. I think like. When we just kind of got into it, and I figured out that we really when we were shipping V3, like we had to figure out a formula internally even before we even think about the user base. What's this security formula that we want to satisfy to be ourselves confident in the program. And I was harassing my co-founder, and then talking to Robert from multi-sig and like guys from Neodyme. What else can we do, right? Because like security audit, obviously, right? You can open source the program. There's a bunch, like you can, I guess, run some, fuzzers and all that kind of stuff. But then what's this next thing? And then they were like, well, there's formal verification, but none of the programs on Solana have been formally verified. There's no real framework for it. Like, it's just very new. So I was like, I was talking to Robert at the time, like it was a year ago. I was like, well, can you formally verify our program? He's like, we need to see if it's possible. Like, we need to build a framework. So basically, that's what we collaborated on the first time. Like, he built a framework to formally verify our program. And so now I'm kind of trying to figure out what else. Because my question is like, it's kind of, I don't know if you've seen the Oppenheimer movie. It's kind of like, I want 100% certainty that nothing's going to happen. And there's still like, at least 1%, I guess, chance that, or more that something can happen, right? And so my kind of job is like constantly thinking, what else can we do to make sure that, we kind of, lower that, potential percentage. And so for now, it's been just multiple formal verifications, multiple security audits, and making sure that like as many people as possible that are smart have looked at the code and, thought deeply about what else could happen. We're in a place that whenever we send, auditors the code, they would usually, like right now, because they're great auditors like Neodyme or AutoSec, there isn't really anything on the smart contract level. So they start, proposing like social engineering hacks, like what, the risk would be like, what if somebody on a multi-sig is a malicious actor, right? And they want to pass, some kind of malicious instruction, right? Like what potential gamification can happen where, multi-sig is used as intended, right? Like all the functions that have been verified, like are working correctly and are working as we wanted them to work, but they, that can still be used against the user. So we're kind of at that level where we're trying to figure those things out. But yeah, I mean, it never ends, right? Because like for a new program, it's like we're starting from scratch, right? Because it's a new piece of code, and so it's always there.
Yeah, but I think once you get to that point of when security auditors are, for lack of better phrasing, like reaching for less likely things, like that's a good place to be in, where they've dug through the code multiple times, multiple individuals and organizations have, and it's getting harder and harder for them to find any problems or like potential problems. That's a phenomenal place to be at.
Yeah, if your primary concern is social engineering, you're in a good spot, because that's traditional web spot, right? Is like the vast majority of scams and hacks off chain on just sort of traditional web and in real life is social engineering, because that's, and at that point, it's like, absolutely do everything you can to help people out. Also, there's individual responsibility there as well. So like, that's a good place to be in, where it's like, you can, of course, keep pushing for how can we surface information better so that people are less susceptible to social engineering. But also that means, if that's your primary concern, that also means that your technological primitives are pretty freaking solid, and that's great. So I guess congratulations a little bit, right? In that, like, feeling like your technological primitives are solid.
Thank you very much. Like you do get that feeling at some point. And then something like, the biggest question that I usually have to sort of show on my co-founders, like, what are the core dependencies that we have that we don't control, right? Like, what are the dependencies that can potentially pose risks? Like
supply
when Viper, right? Or like when Viper bug happened on EVM, right? Like I learned that there's a compiler bug that also exists, right? That's not applicable to us, but it's still like there's always things you learn that you can potentially figure out how to address, but you just need to take as like the broadest look you can to make sure that nothing else can affect it.
Cool. Well, hey man, we are reaching our time here. I've loved this conversation. It was so awesome meeting you. Do you have any last minute things you want to say to the people? Any final shill?
I guess, use a multi-sig, stay safe. that's the shill.
Love it.
No, thank you guys. It was great. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, cool. All right, man. To the listeners, we will see you in, not next week, because we're moving to every other week. Nick, I got you.
2 weeks.
But we'll see you next episode. 2 weeks.
Right,
so long,
thank
folks.
you so much.